and I'll send you all the link to this as well. So, um, yeah, let me see. I know most of you all are local. Um, Tyler, you're staying in House 8. Um, so did you get the information on that?
Yep, I got the email.
All right, all set. Okay, great. If you have any questions about that, just let me know. Sarah Lee, just so you all know, Sarah Lee is on vacation this week. So if there's anything that comes up, she's checking email. But if for some reason you don't hear from her, you can email me at mreeves@montpelier.org. I'll put my email in there. And I think she CC'd me on the email for this Zoom link. So that's my email. So I will put in my email in here into the chat. So feel free to get a hold of me if you need something. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to do a lecture on some of the history and background of Montpelier that we've discovered through archaeology, and give some context for the excavations y'all are going to be engaged in. And before I started, wanted to see who has get a show of hands if you've been vaccinated. Have most of you all been? So good deal. So it looks like almost everybody has been. Okay, Monroe, you said you have not. All right. What we want to do is we just finished up a month-long archaeology field school, and everyone was vaccinated. So with being outside, we didn't have to wear masks. But if anyone is not vaccinated, then you'd want to wear a mask when you're within like 6 feet of anybody. So that's just, out of an abundance of caution, we'll go ahead and do that. So Monroe, you are the only one that has not been vaccinated. Was there anybody else that hasn't been? And there's no problem. We just want to make sure you wear mask and you're safe. I mean, still allowed to come in the program. There's nothing like that. So, but yeah, we are. I think you all got the email about arriving at Arlington House on Sunday, and you all filled out the information form about whether you could come to that or not, and background information on allergies. For things to bring, it's going to be hot next week because it's July in Virginia. So definitely, you want to bring some sort of hat for sun protection. Bring plenty of water. You're going to need to bring your own water because we're quite a ways from the visitor center, and so bringing lots of water bottles is good. There's a whole list of items to bring, and just wanting to hit the highlights of that. Another thing you'll want to bring is either a pair of walking boots, work boots, or a pair of good sturdy sneakers. We don't want anybody with flip-flops at the site, because if you drop a bucket on your foot, that's not going to feel very good if you don't have some kind of foot protection. So basically, closed-toed shoes are a requirement. And we, with the program that we run, we're going to go over this when you all arrive. But we're going to be treating you as part of the archaeology team. I mean, that's one thing that we take a lot of pride on with our expeditions. This is something where we reintegrate you all into the team with the other archaeologists. I mean, we don't expect you to know how to excavate a unit. You're going to be trained that during next week. But in terms of what you're going to be doing during the day, it's going to be working with the team and being part of the team. And so if there's any time that you want to go somewhere, like you want to go to the visitor center or see some other part of the property, let us know and we'll figure out a way to have you see that. But we want you to be at the site in your unit with everybody. That's pretty important in terms of just the esprit de corps and, keeping up that sense of teamwork. And you'll get a sense of this when you arrive. You're going to be working pretty much side by side with the archaeology staff. So this is going to give a lot of exposure to the different techniques that we use for archaeology, artifact identification, and then also questions. If you're interested in pursuing a career in archaeology or museum studies, this is a great time to ask questions about that. So it's something that we always look at these expeditions, especially with high school students, as a chance to expand your options in terms of what you might be interested in doing. And I know a number of you all are from the Blue Ridge Virtual Governor's School, and if anybody's interested in doing, using this for your senior project, would be, more than happy to talk with you about that. I know so for those of y'all with the Blue Ridge Virtual Governor's School, I was talking to Mark Caraway earlier today, and he said you have the option just to take this for experience or to actually do it for your project. And I know he has some requirements for that. Is anybody doing this for their project? Just a thumbs up or hands up. Okay, cool. Oh, Kate, you're doing that. Okay, good deal. Yeah, we should definitely talk then, because there's a lot of things that you can do. A lot of options, everything from the site you're working on to other projects that we've done in the past. So what we're going to do is we'll do dinner at Arlington House on Sunday, and then when you all arrive on the site on Monday, that's where we're going to do more formal introductions with everybody and get some of your background. But tonight, what we're going to do is, because obviously not all the staff is here and not all the participants are here, but so on Monday we'll do introductions and go over more of the schedule for the week. What we'll be doing day by day. And does anybody have any questions about that before? Oh, Abby, you're asking, are chaperones allowed to come to dinner with us, or is it just us? Yeah, absolutely. As long as you've let Sarah Lee know, because we need to do a head count of how many people are coming. So if anybody is more than just yourself coming who isn't registered, let us know and we'll buy a meal. So so that was that Abby who asked about that? Okay, all right, I'll put you down, Abby, for 2. So, and that'll be at Arlington House. And yeah, dinner at Arlington is very casual. It's in foldable camp chairs, super relaxed. So don't worry about that. The only thing you might want to do is wear long pants, because there are mosquitoes. So if you're susceptible to the mosquito bites in the evening, that might not be the funnest thing to have shorts on. So, or just bring some bug spray. Anybody else have any other questions about arrival, things to bring? Yeah, Hannah.
Yeah, I just had one quick question. So when I was reading over the sheet, I know it said to bring like lots of water bottles and your own water bottle, but will there be any sort of like reservoir or something like, or Gatorade stand or anything to fill it up, or just bring multiple?
Just to be safe, bring multiple waters, and because sometimes the visitor center isn't open, and bring multiple waters. I'm going to try to see if we can get a reservoir for that. So, and I think there's been with COVID, there have been regulations on the property about water and having it to be in a closed container, and we could have some extra water bottles for emergency, but we all hate wasting water bottles. So bring some extra water bottles. That'd be good. So let me see what other questions are in the chat here. Yeah, for the Friday, okay, Monroe, you'll be 2 as well. 2. The Friday dinner isn't a dinner. I'm sorry if we haven't done a dinner on Friday like in 2 years. The Friday is a reception at 3 o'clock over by where the archaeology lab is, at a place called Lewis Hall. We'll show you where that is. The Friday reception is really more of a debrief for the participants and staff, just to review what happened over the week, what questions you might have, suggestions for improvement, that sort of thing. So, and then Devin, you asked, what time do we arrive on Sunday? For Sunday, arriving around 5:30. I think that's the time that that Sarah Lee put in the email. Let me check and see. Arlington. I'm looking right now, just to be consistent. Yeah, first night we'll be meeting at Arlington House at 5:45. Yeah, so actually, go ahead and we'll meet at 5:45 at Arlington House because no one's staying at Arlington House. So arriving at 5:45 would be a good time because we're just going to eat dinner there. Let's see, what other questions were there? Parents arrive. Cool. Catherine, did that answer the question about dinner? Okay, good deal. So, but I mean, if your folks want to come to the Friday reception, that's more than fine. It's at 3 o'clock, and you could let them know where it's going to be on the property. So, be more than happy to have them come to that. So, cool. So it looks like we just have Monroe and Abby. You all are the only ones that are having a guest come with you. Okay, sounds good. Well, cool. Well, what we'll do at this point is I will go ahead. Are there any other questions about arrival, how to get to Arlington? How many of you all are being dropped off in the morning? Does anybody have that situation? Devin, you're going to be dropped off in the morning. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, we'll have to let you know the gate code for Montpelier is 1101 star. So, for you won't need to worry about that on Sunday because you don't go through the front gate on Sunday. You go over to Arlington, just follow the directions there. But for Monday morning, you'll be arriving early enough where the gate will be closed. And so you'll need to enter that code in and then just basically follow directions to the visitor center. And we meet at the visitor center because it's the easiest place to meet. And all the signs direct you to the visitor center. So it's pretty hard to get lost. We have tens of thousands of visitors that make it to the visitor center, and you all can too. So, yeah, for Monday morning, we are meeting at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. So, and we'll be meeting pretty much every morning at 8 o'clock. And we're going to be, yeah, probably for the whole time, you all are going to be parking at the visitor center and walking down to the site from there. So, but I'll show you an image of what that looks like. How many of you all been to Montpelier before? I imagine most of you all have. So, cool. All right, sounds good. Well, then what I'll do is let's see if there's another. Okay, you got all the questions. Awesome. And well, I'll go ahead and start the Power of Place lecture. And this lecture, what we really want to do is give you some context for Montpelier and context for the site that we're going to be working on, which is a 1820s blacksmith site that's attached to the farm complex. And like we'll talk about, you're going to learn this all next week, but all the sites that we work on at Montpelier are ones that we're actively interpreting to the public, and they're ones that we want to one day actually restore for visitors to be able to see. So the research that you're going to be helping us with is actually part of our overall interpretive plan for Montpelier, and we're doing research, but the research has a purpose, which is helping to have visitors understand what James Madison's home was, which it was a plantation, and then bringing to light, the lives of the enslaved Americans who lived and worked there for over 100 years. And the PowerPoint I'm going to give you all, go over with you all next, goes over into a lot of these details for this. And one concept that we want to introduce to you all is it's one that isn't exactly defined in one way. There's multiple definitions for it, but it's called the power of place, and the power of place is, it's something that a lot of museums use to uh, really give context for the history that they talk about. And when you think about, and there's no right answer for this, this is just open discussion. For power of place, for like a place like Montpelier, what does this bring to mind to you? Like, what do you think of when you think of power of place, when you think of Montpelier? Yeah, Abby.
Kind of makes me think of like the specific placement of the site on the property
Mhm.
kind of determines its role. So if the gardens are near the water, you can determine that that little crop of land was a garden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the almost like the power replacement, which is a huge part of what we do with archaeology is understanding, that sites just aren't plopped down randomly in the landscape. They're put there intentionally, for sometimes for function, like you're saying, like gardens near a water source. Um, and sometimes they're put there for, where they can be seen and where they can't be seen. And I see there's one chat. Devin, you said the importance of the site. And what do you mean by that, Devin? Go into what do you mean by importance?
I mean by like what happened at the site, and not just that the site is there. It's what happened, who lived there at that particular place.
Yeah. So do you mean the importance of it today, or the importance of it back, when the site was being occupied, or both?
Both, yeah.
Both, yeah, yeah. And of course, yeah, like you're saying, importance is definitely in the eyes of the beholder. So for the blacksmith site, the one we're working on right now, it had importance to Madison, or the Madison family, in terms of the production of the plantation. Like the blacksmith site, that's where tools are being repaired, and if it wasn't there, basically the farm would not be able to function. But then for the enslaved blacksmith, it meant that, for that was the place where their skills were being recognized, and they were able to use their skills in some cases to their own advantage, and in some cases not to their advantage, because they were enslaved and they didn't have a choice in what they were doing. So all depends on where it is. And then of course today, yeah, that's a little bit of what we're going to go into today, is like, why are these sites important today? So definitely. What else, you all? Oh, I got my notes up. Does somebody have their hand up?
I guess I don't know, maybe a little vague, but a bit going off of what Devin said is like maybe the people themselves, like the power of the placement of the people, like the people who lived in Montpelier, like the house itself, like they were on the highest top of the hierarchy, and then like the enslaved people at the bottom, and it's like the placement of the people and like who's in the house versus who's like out back where they can't be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the power of place in terms of, who, the power that was vested to them by land ownership, or in this case, ownership of one person over another human being, and then having, say, for example, having the government, the U.S. Constitution, back up that power in terms of power of property at that time meant specifically power of owning other individuals. So yeah, absolutely. It's and this is where, like what you said, Hannah, it is pretty vague, the definition of this, and it's very much open. And that's really what the National Trust is, the group who owns Montpelier. They own a lot of properties all over the US, and for them, power of place is a huge part of what they talk about, because it has so many different meanings. It has meanings today for, the power of place for Montpelier, for example, for descendants of the enslaved community, has a very different power, because their ancestors are literally buried at Montpelier. And we're going to visit the slave cemetery when you all are here next week, and it has a very different, power of place than it does for me, for example, who, I've been working at Montpelier for 20 years, and so have a lot invested in the research and the relationships I have with staff that are there and colleagues and former field school students, expedition members, just like you all are. So it has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. So it's both past and present. So yeah, and this is something we're going to be, revisiting at the end of the week, is you all are going to be seeing a lot of different sites when you're at Montpelier, not just the blacksmith shop that you're going to be excavating on. We're going to bring you all to the Gilmore cabin, which was a cabin built by two individuals, a couple that were formerly enslaved at Montpelier in the 1870s, the Gilmore family. You're going to visit the Civil War camps. You're going to visit the main house. We're going to be able to get you inside an exhibit that we just put together about 3 years ago called The Mere Distinction of Color, that was designed by staff, but more importantly, designed by the descendant community, who we've been working with for 20 years on this research and interpretation. So want to have you all, think about this during your whole time at Montpelier, what Montpelier means in terms of the research, what it means in terms of, the past, what we're looking at, and what it means in terms of today for, all the different visitors that come, visitors that have never thought about slavery before, or those that, are students of the 18th and 19th century life, and those who are, have family ties to Montpelier. So, but what I'll do is I will go ahead and share screens at this point. And oops, I did not share screens. Let's see, share screens. And I'm gonna, share this one. And bring this over here. Let's see if this will project in the right location. Oh, let me see. All right. Can everybody see the full presentation now? Cool. All right. Well, what I want to do is go over in some ways this will be a chronological presentation of some of the history of Montpelier, but also what we're really focusing on now is, not so much the main house, but and you'll get a tour of the main house on Monday with Sarah Lee, who you've been corresponding with over email, and some of you have called her as well. But really, what we're interested in looking at, been looking at for the past 5 years, and want to be looking at this for many years, is the sites of labor at Montpelier and this lost plantation landscape. What most people think of when you think of Montpelier is the main house, and with the main house, what comes to mind is James Madison and also Dolly Madison. But what the majority of the folks that lived and worked at Montpelier were enslaved. They're enslaved Americans, starting from the 1720s all the way up until the Civil War. But during Madison ownership, which is from the 1720s up until 1844, there were a massive number of people enslaved at Montpelier and called Montpelier home for 5 generations. Over 300 people were enslaved at Montpelier, and at any one time there was about 120 enslaved, men, women, and children at Montpelier. And what we found in doing the archaeology is that while the enslaved community are nearly invisible with the documentary records, they are most visible in the archaeology. In fact, they are what you see when you do archaeology in the landscape. And this is what really gives Montpelier a real grounding, is most of what we've been able to discover about Montpelier comes from the physical evidence that's at the property today and was deposited there, some 200 to 150 years ago. And what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is how those deposits were formed, why they're preserved so well, and then how we're finding these sites. So for Montpelier, the property that we've got is, I'll show you a bigger map of this, but the area that's outlined in white is about 2,650 acres. We're about, 6 miles to the west of the town of Orange. And for a good part of the 20, 30 years of archaeology that's happened at Montpelier, the sites that we've been excavating are sites where people were living. So everything from the South Yard, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail, the picture on the upper left, these are the excavations we did in 2011 of 2 of the duplexes, and the buildings in the background. The building far in the background, of course, is the main house, but these buildings that are in timber frame outlines were how we used to represent the buildings on the landscape before we got, the large grant to actually reconstruct them. And you're going to be doing a tour of the South Yard with Terry, so you'll get to know the space very well. And so here's what it looks like almost today. This is in 2017 before we finished these 2 excavations, but I love this shot because we're excavating the fence line right here. So you've got all the archaeology open here, and then these sites, and then these sites that are reconstructed, and then you've got the kitchen and the north dwelling. They were just getting ready to reconstruct. And in contrast to the South Yard, you've got the quarters for field slaves, which are in the field way below the visitor center. So up here you can see the visitor center, and there's the parking lot. This shot was taken early in the morning in July of 2013, and we had just finished excavating this quarter for field slaves, or we thought it was a quarter for field slaves. Actually, it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. And this is right in the area where you're going to be working. We're going to be off to the north just a little bit, where the blacksmith shop is. And given that the blacksmith shop is just to the north of here, it might give you an idea of probably who was living here. And what's wild is we thought this was a quarter for field slaves, field workers, and we were finding all kinds of blacksmith material, which we couldn't figure out because back in 2013, we didn't know the blacksmith shop was just like, 200 feet away. So it just shows you, one of you, I think it was, I can't remember if it's Abby or Hannah, you mentioned the power of place being where things are positioned. Yeah, where you're positioned on this landscape back in the past, it determined, where you're living is really close to where you are working. So we can get a real good association of that. But at these sites of living spots, where people are living for, 10, 20 years, and this is the reconstruction of this log cabin. And I'm going to move you all over here so you can see the whole screen. This is the reconstruction of this log cabin that we excavated here. We reconstructed this back in 2014, and this is the building that's still out there. But at these house sites, what you find are lots and lots of artifacts, lots of ceramics, bottle glass, all kinds of, tobacco pipe fragments, nails, animal bone, all the materials you would expect from, that would be broken and deposited where people are living. What we're looking at, though, is more of the sites of labor. So like the storage sheds, the granaries, and actually even in some cases, we're going to be, trying to locate what evidence there is for the fields and where crops are being processed out in the fields. And then everything from artifacts you find to the actual evidence for, the ditching that was done in some of the low areas. And I sent you all or Sarah Lee sent you a story map of some of the work we've done in the Eastwoods. I don't know if y'all had a chance to look at that. Did anybody see did y'all get the background information for the readings? I see a couple of you. Hannah, you're nodding. Yeah, cool. So, and so with this, the reason why we're interested in these sites of labor is, one is we're interested in full-scale restoration, not just where people are living, but also showing where people are laboring and showing that, really giving evidence that Montpelier was a working farm. And in terms of being a working farm, it was a different kind of farm than you think of today because all the people were enslaved. So in a lot of ways, it was a labor camp, more akin to what you'd think of a penitentiary, where people are forced to stay in place and can't leave, even if their children are sold. So there's a lot of sacrifices that the enslaved community made to make Montpelier, which in turn made the US in terms of the contributions that Madison made. And so we want to tell this full story. And what we really, see as the power of place of these sites is these archaeological sites, bear witness to the labor of the enslaved Americans at Montpelier. And the evidence that we're finding at the ground really makes it much easier for visitors to understand what these sites are. And it gives it more credence because, in a lot of cases, visitors are coming to Montpelier to see, the home of James Madison, this iconic figure. And when they hear that he was an enslaver, it really knocks them for a loop. And by talking about the evidence, the physical evidence of the people that were enslaved at Montpelier, it helps to meet people where they're at in a lot of cases and develops an understanding that, what we're doing at Montpelier is presenting an authentic picture of not just what Montpelier looked like, but who Mr. Madison was. That, sure, he was the 4th president of the United States. He was the father of the Constitution, but he also owned and enslaved, over 300 people. So that's, something really important to understand if you're going to understand who he was as a politician and, why he was doing what he was doing. I mean, why did he, conceptualize and write a document that made sure that, that secured that enslaved people remained enslaved, and that when you understand that a huge part of his own personal economic investment was in people, and then the people he was trying to convince who were in power to ratify the Constitution also owned people, all of a sudden this starts to make a lot more sense that, you see the economic rationale behind some of this. So given, having these sites bear witness to the actions of enslaved individuals and the actions of Madison, make this a more authentic experience that really allow visitors to begin to think critically about, who, where the American Constitution came from and what these sites of heritage are. And the other thing that we really battle with at Montpelier is how many of y'all have been to Monticello? You give a thumbs up or a nod if you have. Yeah, so it looks like a number of people have. Let's see. Got something in the chat. Oh, yes, Devin, Monroe, Hannah. Yeah. So at Monticello, when you went there, probably if you were, looking for, any evidence that they had of the enslaved individuals who lived there, you would see a lot of information, even photos of former slaves and descriptions of the fields and how many acres were in wheat and who was working them. That's because at Monticello, they have, all of the farm records there survive. What we have at Montpelier is that in the 1850s, after Dolly Madison sold the estate, all the family papers for Montpelier ended up in John Payne Todd's hands. And John Payne Todd is the wayward stepson of James Madison. This is Dolly's son by her first marriage. He ended up being a drunk and a gambler later in his life, racked up a huge amount of debts. And when Dolly sold the estate, he gathered up all the family papers to try to, see what assets there are that he could sell. And then when he died in the 1850s, all of Madison's nieces and nephews went to his house just outside of Gordonsville called Todd's Berth and found literally 2 rooms full of documents. And what they did is look through them, brought them all up to the backyard, and then put a match to them because they were worried that there was too much scandal. Yeah, see your reaction, Hannah, that there was too much scandal entrapped with those. And they also, wrote about this to a local paper, that their Uncle Jimmy, James Madison, was an incredibly private man who wouldn't want his personal life revealed. Well, with those documents burning, the identity of, the hundreds of enslaved people at Montpelier was lost. And so what we rely on is the archaeological record to really bring that identity back and to begin to flesh out, what was at Montpelier. And we're incredibly lucky at Montpelier that what we've got is, some really well-preserved landscape. And why we have this is for the first 120 years of Montpelier being, cleared and worked by enslaved Africans, you've got basically site formation. Between 1720 and the 1840s, you have, fields being cleared, barns being built, slave quarters being built beside the fields and then being moved, and the archaeological remains being left behind. And then when Dolly sells the property in 1844, a lot of these sites are abandoned and just allowed to crumble into the ground. And after that, after 1844, the plantation goes into decline up until the Civil War, and you go from about 120 individuals being enslaved at Montpelier down to 25. And so a lot of these sites are abandoned. And then through up until the 1901, when the DuPonts buy the property, you basically have less and less, people living at Montpelier. There's a lot of changes to the main house. But then in 1901, when the DuPonts buy it, what they do is they make massive changes to the house, but as it turns out, don't do much to the landscape. They don't have their workers do a lot of plowing. They don't, timber the woods. It's the DuPonts. These are, DuPonts of DuPont chemical fame who don't need to make money off the land. They bought this as an estate to run as like a country, estate to escape to. And so you just get massive preservation. And what this results in is just archaeological sites that are just unparalleled for this part of Virginia. Now, for Montpelier, this is a map showing Montpelier. Route 20 is right along here. The visitor core with the main house is right down in this area. So when you visit Montpelier, you park in the parking lot right there, go through the visitor center, and then go up to the main house. And what most people see, and where we're going to be working is right down here, just across from the Madison Family Cemetery. That's where the blacksmith shop is they see a tiny fraction of this property. And, which includes the Gilmore cabin. You'll see that as well next week. But what was originally here, what we've got is about 2,700 acres. There's about 15 to 1,600 acres that are original Madison lands. And then of this, you've got 1,800 acres of woods. And of those 1,800 acres of woods, there's probably about 400 acres that were in woods back in the day, but the rest are fields. So many of these sites have returned, from fields back to woods. And so you've just got all these sites that are been preserved. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but we're doing metal detector surveys all across the property to find these sites. And we've surveyed about 400 acres. This is the area that's in green with all these red dots here, which are the sites. We've surveyed about 400 of the 2,700 acres, and we've found literally hundreds of sites. And so we've got a lot more work to do at Montpelier, but already with what we've found, especially these small sites, these tiny ones are all these Madison era sites. The big ones are Civil War encampments. And we'll talk about that next week as well. You're going to visit these Civil War camps on the north side of the property, and I'll give a little bit of information on those tonight. But primarily what we are concerned with are these smaller domestic and work sites from the Madison era. So for the Madison era, what I'm going to go into next is do a brief, history of the Madison era and focus on the 3 generations of Madison ownership. And anytime that you all have questions, don't hesitate to, ring out with the questions. Don't be shy. So, and I'll try to keep the chat. Let me pop the chat out. So if anybody does have a question, I'll put that over here. I can see that. So for Sarah Lee is going to be giving you all a tour of the visitor core on Monday when after you're done excavating for the day. But what I wanted to do is give an overview of the land ownership history of Montpelier, but give it from the perspective of the kind of labor that was happening at Montpelier during this time, and not so much focus on the main house, but talk about how different generations of Madisons were managing the land and forcing slaves to do very different things. And this is important for understanding the context of what you're going to be finding this next week. So early on, the plantation was run by Madison's grandmother, Frances Taylor Madison. She ran the plantation from 1732 up until her death in 1761. As Sarah Lee will talk to you about, she was a widow. Her husband died in 1732. He was poisoned by two of his slaves and a neighboring slave. And Francis Madison, after that, never remarried. And we always have the question of who really poisoned Ambrose Madison, the grandfather, because Frances was pretty intentional about never remarrying. And when after her husband died, she actually changed the conditions of her husband's will, in which he stipulates that his eldest son, James Madison Sr., which was also Francis's son, was going to take over the plantation in 1741. When Frances, gets control of the plantation, she says, "Nope, I'm going to maintain control of the plantation." This was in the deed that she wrote up in 1737. She was going to maintain control until she died, which happened in 1761. So all through the 1740s and 50s, she's marketing tobacco in her own name. And so when you look at how tobacco was being farmed at that time, is basically it was slash and burn agriculture, where they would girdle the trees, cut a ring of bark off the bottom, it would kill the tree, and then slaves are forced to use hoeing hoes to hoe the soil into hills and then plant tobacco in those hills. So it's pretty brutal labor. And by the time you get to the American Revolution, not only is the bottom fall out of the tobacco market, because we're at war with England, our primary purchaser of tobacco at the time, but also the land was pretty worn out. And during the time that Frances was running the plantation as a tobacco plantation, her son, James Madison Sr., he begins to, instead of having slaves that he can work in the tobacco fields, he has to do other things. So he starts building a mercantile. It starts importing goods from England and selling them to the local community. He sets up a massive blacksmith shop up close to where the main house is today. And this picture right here is a picture of what the main house looked like in 1765. This little building right here, it was the main where the family was living from 1750 all the way up until 1762. And it's only after that Francis dies that they begin to build the main house, because basically up until that point, Francis was the matriarch of the plantation, and the family seat was down at Mount Pleasant, which is down by the Madison Family Cemetery, which is about a half a mile from where the main house is today. So in the 1740s and 1750s, what James Madison Sr. is doing is he has his slaves set up a massive blacksmith shop. They're making plows and wagons for the local community for sale, of course. And what he does is gears Montpelier to have its economy be supported by the local community, other farms and plantations. And what this means is that by the time you get into the era when the bottom falls out of the tobacco market, Montpelier has no economic impact from that, because it's they've diversified the economy with James Madison Sr. And what he starts doing in the 1770s, when the land is worn out from tobacco production, is, since he has blacksmiths that are developing plows, he starts having his slaves plow the land and starts growing grains that then are shipped to ports such as Fredericksburg, and they make a lot of money off of this diversified landscape. And so during this time, when James Madison Jr., he's the future President Madison, the son of Nellie Conway Madison, James Madison Sr., when he's coming of age, he's in school, he's able to pursue his political career and not worry what's happening on the plantation. And so this diversified and really well-run plantation happens and keeps on going all the way up until James Madison Jr. takes over the operation in the 1790s. And by this time, James Madison Jr., as Sarah Lee will tell you about on Monday, he's written the Virginia Plan, gone through the ratification of the Constitution. He's well on his way. He served in the legislature. He's well on his way, and he doesn't know it at this point in the 1790s, to become Secretary of State for 2 terms, and then later on President for 2 terms. And he finally retired. He and Dolly finally retire in 1816. But in the 1790s, he thinks he's going to be retiring back to Montpelier. And he and Dolly get married in 1795. And in 1797, they add this addition onto the house and add the front portico onto the house. So they change the parents' house from this Georgian style structure into a neoclassical federal, appearing structure with this portico. And what he starts doing is having his slaves engage in what's called, at the time period, scientific farming, which is, doing contour plowing, manuring the fields. And what happens during this time is he gets rid of the blacksmith shop that provided all the wool for the plantation, moves it from where it was beside the main house, because he doesn't want to have that operation so close to the main house that he's going to design this formal landscape for, and moves it out to where we're excavating it today out of the farm complex. So the blacksmith shop we're excavating is not the one that was set up and run for the parents' generation. This is the one that Madison has moved in the 1790s. And basically what Madison does during the retirement years is he makes massive changes to the house where he adds wings onto the house. So remember, this is what the house looked like in the 1790s. By the time you get into the 18 teens, he has these wings added onto the house. He makes this formalized landscape, basically sets up the house for entertaining all the guests that visit him and Dolly when they're retired after 1817. And basically what he does is he drives Montpelier economically into the ground. And what they end up relying on is not producing crops, but really producing people that then they either take loans out on or sell. And so you might remember that in 1808 is when the transatlantic slave trade ends, and what begins when all the new South, like the areas of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, start being set up for cotton production, is slaves are no longer being imported from Africa. They're being transported across the US, and in this case from Virginia through Richmond and then down to New Orleans, where they're sold to the highest bidder. And this eventually is what happens to all the slaves at Montpelier. By the time that Dolly sells the estate in 1844, so Madison dies in 1836, Dolly takes over the estate and she actually moves back to Washington, D.C. By the time she sells the plantation in 1844, she sold over half the slaves, but probably the vast majority of the slaves who are of working age and have the most value. And then in 1844, she sells everything, lock, stock, and barrel, all of Montpelier and the rest of the community. And this, of course, is, for the enslaved community, is their absolute worst nightmare, because when you're sold at auction, it doesn't matter if you're sold in family units. When you're brought to the auction block, you're sold to the highest bidder. So this is when, mothers and their children are separated. You never see your aunt and uncle again. It's a pretty brutal, it is the worst nightmare, for slaves. It's what, former slaves who were interviewed in the 1930s by the WPA administration talk about as, one of the cruelest parts of the institution of slavery is the division of families. It wasn't being whipped. It wasn't poor living conditions. In fact, those were, for a plantation like Montpelier, weren't really what slaves were exposed to. Because if you think about, if the Madisons know they're going to be selling the slaves, the last thing they're going to want to do is mistreat the slaves and whip them. Because if you're an enslaved individual and you have whip marks on your back, what do you think that is going to represent to somebody who's going to buy you? If you get weakness, either that that you were not working hard enough because you were not capable, so you were whipped, which would happen, or that as a mentally you were not what would be defined as a strong laborer, because you were resisting that work either through feigned sickness, maybe work slowdowns, and you had to be beaten to actually work at a level that was seen as productive by the overseer. In fact, the Madisons were, and this is Jefferson too, were so concerned about their slaves and their value that they ordered their overseer not to whip them. And a lot of people, in the more recent past have interpreted that as like, oh, well, Madison and Jefferson were good slave owners because they didn't whip their slaves. It's, in fact, you know, no, it's a very, almost a more sinister than being whipped. They were trying to preserve the value of their slaves so they could be sold and separated from their families. So it's not a, you know, there is no good owner of people. That's just a misnomer that does not exist. So what a lot of the archaeology does is it reflects this history. I mean, what the story I'm telling you right now, some of this comes from the documentary record. Most of it comes from what we've learned from, you know, the archaeology of these spaces. And so what I want to talk about next is how we know about, you know, what we know about Montpelier, but first, how all this stuff got preserved. So in 1844, after Dolly sells the estate, what happens is you go from about 100, well, by 1844, there's 70 slaves left. They're sold, and you go down to about 25 enslaved individuals by the 1850s. And so all the buildings that are south of the main house, so south of the main house is the South Yard. That's why it's called the South Yard. If you keep on walking south, you get to the visitor center. And then further south is where we're working today, which is the farm complex. And I'll show you a picture of this that shows it in relationship to the main house. So all these areas are abandoned and the buildings are either torn down or allowed to decay in place. And when you look at a big map of this, what you can see is this red circle represents, this is where the main house is. This is the farm complex. This area right here is abandoned by 1844. And then by the late 1840s, the new farm complex is built on the opposite side of the property. And what that means is all this area down here is never occupied again, meaning all the artifacts we find, we know date to the Madison era because we know all this area is abandoned after Dolly sells the land. And then furthermore, with the new farm complex being built up here, it means that this farm complex remains as the main farm complex all through the 20th century, which means any kind of development that happens at Montpelier doesn't happen down here. It happens over here, where today we have the archaeology lab, and you're going to visit that next week. And so all this area remains basically untouched, which is just really mind-blowing. In fact, when we started building the visitors center, since we built it starting in 2002, we did archaeological survey, and we made sure we didn't disturb any of these sites when we built the visitors center. And we'll get into that when you all come to the site next week and how that happened. But after Dolly sells the property, really all the way up until the Civil War, you know, the enslaved community is much smaller. When you have the most number of people at Montpelier is during the Civil War. And this is when there are these Confederate encampments that are set up first in the summer of 1863, going into the spring, into the fall. And these are these summer Confederate encampments that are all these areas shown in yellow. So here's Route 20 right here. Here's where we're going to be working. All this ridgeline of woods that are in here, like when you drive out of Montpelier and you go along Back Road, there's all these summer encampments that are in this area. And then where the winter encampments are from January through May of 1864 are the ones out in the Northwoods. So right here is where the Gilmore cabin is. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But all back in here, you've got these winter encampments that we've done surveys on. And we've actually reconstructed some examples of these encampments to not just to talk about the winter encampments, but also to put into context, what the Civil War meant to the country at the time, which it was really, putting the Constitution on trial, because the South was fighting over slavery, which, revolved around states being able to decide whether they can enslave people. Northern states were, more on the side of a stronger federal government, which was mandating that, in some cases that slavery be restricted, not necessarily end. That was much later in the Civil War when it was a tactical advantage of Lincoln's to have the Emancipation Proclamation be set forth. But there's, different forces at play here that really bear out the legacy of Madison, the inaction that he and the other founding fathers never took on slavery is why this country ends up having a civil war. And it's something that was one of their biggest fears, but they really never did anything about, because they prioritized the economy and the preservation of the Union over, the state of freedom for a whole group of people, primarily people of color. So this is where, the power of place, when you think about the Civil War encampments for, if you're a Civil War buff, the power of place for the Civil War encampments is, this is where, all these soldiers camped and spent the winter. If you look at power of place in terms of these camps and what they represent about Montpelier in our story of the Constitution, it's really where the Constitution failed the people of the United States and the founding fathers in putting priority over the preserving the economic power of a few over the many led to the Civil War. Because basically who is benefiting from slavery wasn't most of the people. It was like 5%, and that's a pretty generous number to give. 5% of the population benefited from slavery. So, who is a citizen and who's really enjoying democracy when you're looking at the 18th and 19th century? It's a small group of people. If you're a Black person in the United States under slavery, you certainly don't enjoy the benefits of the Constitution, both before and after the Civil War, because after the Civil War, it fails, us again because of, Jim Crow, where states are able to reign, social power and racism over individuals. So this is a huge question that we want to look at Montpelier is, what is citizenship? How is it defined by the Constitution? How it's carried out? And then using these sites that we're able to excavate to really show how this took place in America. And it gives a very different picture of, what the Constitution is, what it means today, and what, where a lot of the issues we're facing, with racism and then the many issues we still have today, come from. But, getting back to the story of preservation of Montpelier, in the post-emancipation era, this is when there's a lot of changes that happened to the main house, a lot of changes that we, when we did the restoration, we undid to figure out what the place looked like during Madison's era. But also, it's when there's a lot of free Blacks that settle at Montpelier to set up small farms. And the Gilmore family is one of those families. And again, you're going to be visiting the Civil War encampments and the Gilmore farm next week, and you'll get into some more details on this. But for the DuPont period, in 1901, William DuPont and Annie Zen DuPont bought Montpelier, and they make it into this massive estate. They take this relatively small 30-room house and expand it into 60 rooms. And in this picture right here, this is the same angle of the back of the house. Here's the back porch, that what we call the colonnade. And these additions that get put on, the second stories on these one-story additions that were added in 1810, basically the mansion is sucked into all these DuPont additions. And what's great about this is we figured out later, like in 2004 through 2008, when we did the restoration of the house, that so much of that original fabric from the Madison period was preserved in the DuPont period. It was just moved around. But what's really great about Montpelier during this time period is the area that gets developed, like I mentioned, is the northern part of the property. This 1850s farm area continues to get developed. And then the rest of the property where the original Madison farm was gets left alone. And so what happens in the DuPont years is, by like 1908 is when the DuPonts finished their construction, and it pretty much remains unchanged since that time period. And then when the National Trust buys Montpelier in 1984, fortunately, the National Trust barely has enough money to keep Montpelier open, so they don't have the money to do a bunch of construction. And so when the Montpelier Foundation starts in 2000, we inherit, we run Montpelier today. It's still owned by the National Trust, but we started doing really intensive surveys to locate any kind of sites before any kind of construction happened. And part of this, was when we actually restored the main house. Before we restored the main house, we did not only surveys of the land around the main house, but of the main house itself. And what we discovered when the Mellon family gave us a gift of $25 million in 2002 when Paul Mellon died, and it's kind of ironic, the Mellon family gave Montpelier money to tear off the DuPont wings. So it's like the Mellons and the DuPonts, and the Mellon family actually, before they gave us the money, they were like, you need to get the DuPont's approval for this because we know the irony of our money being used to take off the DuPont additions. So we had that's where we built the visitor center and, had a whole DuPont wing added to that. But over the period of about 4 years, we carefully deconstructed, and then reconstructed what the main house looked like. And if you all are interested in any of this work, we're actually putting all this online in a 3D model of the main house. And we got a grant to basically document all this in a 3D model in GIS. So there's tons of information we're entering in on this, and I can send you links to that if you're interested. But during the last part of the restoration, what we started doing was archaeology on the landscape, because we knew that the house wasn't just sitting there in the 20th century landscape, it was set in a plantation. And one of the first things we wanted to do was to figure out what the landscape around the main house looked like. And what we discovered was that there was a front fence that the early, in the 1840s, there was a road brought up to the front of the house, the grade was lowered, and then the clay from that was used to cover over this old Madison Road. And based on an 1817 watercolor that was done, we knew there was a fence line and a carriage road out here. So in doing the archaeology, what we found were the fence post holes, the post holes from this fence. So all these posts were installed into post holes that looked like this. This is looking inside one of these post holes, and you can see the charred outline of these posts. And there was a PDF for a booklet that we sent you all that showed some of these pictures. Did you all see some of those? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so and we're going to give you a copy of that booklet when you arrive on Sunday night. So you'll actually have the paper version of it. But what we did is basically did the archaeology to figure out where these post holes are. We actually found the last set of wagon ruts that were buried in the 1840s. What Steve, one of the archaeologists at the time in 2006, is pointing at are these wagon ruts that are pushed into the clay, and then they were buried in 1848. And if you're wondering what a wagon rut looks like, you'll be looking at this next week, because we're actually excavating a road at the blacksmith shop where we found evidence of some of these wagon ruts, which are just really just amazing. So, because what's cool about it is it tells us where the road is. And when you think about a wagon with skinny wheels that are about 6 feet tall, so 3.5 feet from the axle, they're designed to sink into the ground and the horse pull it along, so it leaves these massive ruts that you can find archaeologically, as long as the site isn't plowed. And since our site's not plowed, we find these. So what we're able to do with this is, once we discovered where the road and the fence was, is we actually reconstructed this on the landscape. So by 2008, when visitors visited the main house, they could see what this place looked like. And what we did is we extended these excavations to, from the temple that's, still exists today, all the way to what's called the Boxwood Grotto. And we also did investigations of the area of what was called the Pine Alley and the Grove. And in these areas, not only did we find evidence for plantings, but we also found evidence for 18th century buildings that predated all these 1808 through 1812 changes. And so at the main house, we spent, about 17 years excavating at the main house to discover not only these areas, but also a massive trash deposit that we affectionately call Dolly's Midden, which has all these Parisian porcelains, but also these transfer wares, especially the bamboo and peony, that we find everywhere. And so not only were we able to figure out what was on the dining room table, but based on what we found at Dolly's Midden from what the kind of ceramics the Madisons were using, we were able to figure out, when we find ceramics at the slave quarter, if they're not in Dolly's Midden, we know the Madisons didn't buy them, but the slaves are purchasing them. So we're able to figure out, by having these trash deposits be separate from each other, what the Madisons had versus what slaves are purchasing, using the money they're able to generate from the work they're doing in their own gardens in their spare time, which they didn't have very much. So what this leaves is, the back lawn and the terracing in the garden, all this was done in the 18 teens. So just massive amounts of slave labor. And then where the house slaves were living is in the middle of this formal set of grounds in what we call today the South Yard. And we know about the South Yard from this insurance plat that shows all these buildings. And what we did over a period of about 6 years is excavate all these spaces. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because Terry Brock will be giving you a tour of this on Monday afternoon. But what we were able to find in the archaeology of the South Yard is what we're able to discover is there's enough information at these sites to do the same level of accurate restoration that we did of the main house with the investigations we did there with these outbuildings and slave quarters. And what it means is we're able to do the archaeology to bring, these hidden sites of labor and the lives of slaves back to the landscape, which when you're talking about people's lives at a plantation house that people are visiting today, it's really important to be able to have visitors see where, the enslaved families are living. And this is actually something that the descendant community, absolutely insisted that we do. When we finished the restoration of the main house in 2007, we gave the descendant community a tour. And when we were out on this terrace, there were several members, we didn't have any of these buildings reconstructed. We just basically had these 4x4s that outlined on the ground where the building sat. And then we had killed the grass inside the buildings so that they would contrast against the green grass that was around the building. So we thought it was fairly effective to show where the buildings were. And what one of the descendants asked was, so she said, so you did a $32 million restoration of the main house and got it back to what it looks like. And for our ancestors' homes, you've got their homes represented by what look to be railroad ties on the ground and dead grass. And she said, do you see a discrepancy with this? And we were like, holy cow, yes. So what we did is after that, we did enough archaeology where we could build these timber frame representations of the buildings. And the hope was that one day somebody would come along, see these timber frames, recognize that the buildings were there, and then ask, what does it take to reconstruct these buildings? And that's what David Rubenstein did when he visited in 2013. So he gave us a grant to really reconstruct all these spaces. And so what we've spent 2015 through 2019 doing is excavating these areas and recovering the evidence for the smokehouses, and then later on the evidence for the kitchen, which turns out to be the early planter's cottage from the 1750s, and this other slave quarter that dates back to the 18th century as well, and then actually reconstruct these spaces. And as Terry will talk to you about, and Mary will too, when you go through the exhibit, The Mere Distinction of Color, when we were doing this work, we invited the descendant community out to be part of this process. And this, involved us not only, working side by side with the community like we do with the expedition programs, but we began to have a lot of conversations about how we were going to restore this space. And what the descendants requested is that the same degree of dignity that's shown for the Madisons in the main house be shown for their ancestors in these reconstructed spaces, which meant, not just talking about the labor that their ancestors engaged in, but their intellectual lives, what the Constitution meant to them, how they contributed to, the formation of the country by more than just their labor, but how, the very act of having slavery allowed for how that affected the Constitution and what the ramifications of that was. And so we developed an exhibit called The Mere Distinction of Color, where we had really intense conversations with the descendants, and they told this story in their own voice. Literally, their recorded narration of the intersection between race, slavery, and the Constitution, and what this means to them and meant for America, and how the archaeology is able to bear witness to this. So you all will be able to see this exhibit. And this has really gotten us into a lot of conversations about, this part of American history that isn't discussed at a lot of plantation homes. And, is with the descendant community, we put into the forefront of what we're doing. Now, with all this, one thing that the descendants asked us to do is that, they said it's great that we were able to reconstruct the South Yard, but what about the vast majority of their ancestors? Where were they laboring? And this is where, we get into these sites of labor. And, 2013 is when we discovered these quarters for what, we assumed were for field slaves because it was out in a field. And in doing surveys, though, more recently, starting in 2016, when the descendants requested that, we learn more about these spaces, what we started finding is there are a lot more sites than fields out in this area. So there is over 24 buildings that we found through survey. And I'll show you how we did this with metal detector survey in a second. But what we found is that the only sites that were located with standard archaeological techniques are these buildings that are in blue, where you've got lots and lots of artifacts, like the blacksmith shop, these slave quarters, and the overseer's house. A lot of these other sites of labor, like the stable, the work shed, and the threshing barn, you don't find that much in terms of scatterings of artifacts unless you do metal detector survey. And what do you think we find when we do metal detector survey? And this is, while you answer this, I'm going to get a drink of tea so my voice doesn't just completely break here. So if a building decays in the ground, what do you think would be left the metal detector would pick up?
You're gonna find a lot of nails.
Yeah, exactly. Tyler and Catherine, nails are absolutely it. Nails are what metal detectorists call when they come to visit Montpelier and do these programs, because we, just like we have you all coming next week to do programs, we invite metal detectorists out to help us with surveys. And a lot of the folks that come out, they would assume that we're going to be looking for buttons and coins and, and things that were brass. And when we tell them, nope, what we're looking for mostly is nails, they're like, oh my goodness, what are we in for? Who cares about nails? But they get really excited when we start talking about, not only do nails allow us to find where the sites are, because whether it's a barn or a fence, it's going to be held together with nails. But between the 1760s up until 1840, until the late 1840s, nails go through 4 periods of manufacture changes. And with the preservation that we find them at Montpelier, you're actually able to date the site that you find. So just like we were talking about earlier, that each one of these generations of Madison ownership, there's different types of activities happening. Well, we're able to figure out what generation of ownership each of these sites is associated with based on the nails, and then start to build a really complex understanding of the sites we're finding out on the landscape. So when you think about like a tobacco barns have been the same from the 1720s all the way up until like the early 20th century. And the only way you're able to know when a tobacco barn was built is based on the nails that are used to build it. So with the nails, being able to date those, all of a sudden we're able to date the tobacco barn, in the case of Montpelier, to within sometimes a 15 to 20 year time period, which is absolutely mind blowing. So what we've done is we do metal detector surveys across the property. And what we do is use gridded metal detector survey. And do any of these maps look familiar to you from the story maps? Oh, Jude, no problem. We're recording this and I'll send you a link to this so you can look at it later. Jude said he has to leave because this Wi-Fi is pooped out. I sent you all, or Sarah Lee sent you links to some story maps that have these maps in them. If you have a chance, explore them. I will I'll have Sarah Lee send a link along with this, video recording of the lecture tonight, to a story map of the home farm, because you'll be able to explore some of the maps I'm going to show you in a second. But with finding sites, what we do is what we use is what we call 20-meter gridded survey, where we lay out the property on 20-meter grids, which is about 66 feet by 66 feet. That's about a tenth of an acre in size. And then we sweep that entire square. So if you zoom into this area where we've got the main house, the visitor center, and then we're working right here, the blacksmith shop, what metal detectorists do is, in each of these areas, they sweep this entire area looking for any hits. And where their hits are, they do a hit count. But first, they sample some of them to make sure they're not, we're not finding like modern cans or something like that. And then each of these squares is given a value for the number of historic hits that's estimated in these areas. And so when you look at this chart down here, you can see the green is like 0 to 8. And then when you get into the yellow, it's 13 to 31. Orange is 31 to 50. And then red is 50 to 200. So you can see, where, these sites are located. And when you zoom into the home farm, what you can see is what these metal detector surveys allow us to do is locate where these sites are. And then with the nails, we can tell what time period the sites date to. So the Mount Pleasant site has almost all handmade nails. This tobacco barn is a little bit later. It has the cut nails with the handmade tips that predominate. And then the rest of these sites all date to after the 18 teens. So we locate the sites. And then what we do is if this is a 20-meter grid, that's a pretty huge area. It allows you to locate the sites, but not really figure out where to dig. So what we do is we go in and, once we locate these sites, we lay in a 10-foot grid and then do it all over again on the 10-foot grid. And what this does is it gives us hit counts to show where the buildings are. So in the case of the tobacco barn up here, with this one, there's this concentration that's right here. And when we went in and opened up units, so this is Lance, one of our detectorists, the blue grid, these blue flags are the 10-foot grid. And you all see this next week, is he's doing a metal detector sweep and marking all the hits. And then we're recorded on a map where each of these squares, how many hits were found to make this map. And then what we did is we used this information to go in and know where to place units. And in the case of when we sampled, not only were we finding nails, but we were finding these odd teeth that we figured out came from a threshing machine. And so when we started opening up units, and what these threshing machines look like is it's basically a machine that separates the wheat kernel from the shaft of the wheat and the chaff. And then it has a separate winnowing unit that blows the chaff away. And this is usually at a location where they're processing wheat, like for a granary. So we started doing excavations at this site where these concentrations were. And what we started finding is all these burnt trenches, which, turned out to be these trenches from a tobacco barn from the 1790s. But then later on in the 18 teens, there was a threshing machine installed in the middle of it. And this right here, so this threshing barn looks something like this. And in this middle bay is where this machine was installed for threshing the wheat. So what they did is this barn starts out as a tobacco barn, potentially even earlier than the 1790s. We still need to do more excavations on this site to determine this. But then in the 18 teens, when there's more of an emphasis placed on growing grains and plowing, with scientific plowing, with James Madison Jr. taking over the operation of the plantation, it gets changed over to a wheat threshing barn. So what's really wild about this barn is it's right on the path between the visitor center and the Madison Family Cemetery. So it's one of the first sites we want to reconstruct, and because it gives this larger history for this area being this farm complex. But in doing some of the studies, with the metal detector surveys, what we've been able to figure out is what we think is out in this area. And you might have seen this 3D map that we worked with the University of Arkansas on. We've created a 3D imagery of what this landscape looked like. So today, the visitor center is up here, and that used to be the stable and then the paddocks up in this area. And then all this area down in this field that today is an empty field, well, all that at one time was this massive farm complex. So what we're doing this year is going in and doing metal detector survey of these areas to figure this out. And so this is a bird's eye view, or not bird's eye, this is a drone shot of the of the area we're working. 2020, we excavated the overseer's house. This year, we've started with excavating the blacksmith shop, and your all's week that you're going to be here is probably one of the last weeks we're going to be excavating at the blacksmith shop. We're, later on in August, we're going to be down here excavating another earlier blacksmith shop. And then we're going to be doing work up in here in the fall to look at the sites that are up in here, this stable that's here. And this is where that tobacco barn is. And then there's another site up here that we're not sure what it is, but it's this burnt area with lots and lots of nails. So we're going to figure out what that is. So at the blacksmith shop, what we found is, with a metal detector survey, lots of blacksmith material. And what we do with the metal detector surveys on the 10-foot grid is we sample around 3 hits in each of these 10-foot grids. And then what that gives us an idea is, not only what's there, but also a better idea of what to expect in the excavation units. So if you look at, let's see, I'm going to bring up the this map here. Where is it? Give me 1 second here to find this. Oh, shoot. Let me see. I lost this somewhere. Here it is. So bring this over here. This is a GIS map showing where all of our metal detector survey has been happening. So what's in the background? This is the, here's the visitor center and the parking lot. This is the Madison Family Cemetery, and the main house is right here. And what's the 20-meter grid is this coarse grid in the background. And then when you zoom in, this 10-foot grid is this higher resolution grid that we've got here. So I'm going to turn off the 20-meter grid and basically show you where we're going to be excavating next week is all these hot spots in here. So we've done about 3 months of excavations up here where the main part of the blacksmith shop is. We've got a few more units to finish up here, but then we've got units down here where we've got these storage sheds. This one burned based on the scorched nails that we found. And this one, we're still not sure what this one is, but we think it's another building that's related to the blacksmith shop. So next week, we're focused on this area to really flesh this out. But some of the other areas that you're going to visit next week are the area up in here where Dennis has been working on metal detector survey of this burned site where the ground is just completely scorched. He's finishing the sampling up in here and then starting to do metal detector survey of all this area that doesn't have any of these grids. So basically everything in this field that has no grid, we still need to metal detect. And so there's lots and lots of sites that we have not located. The area right in here, this is this quarter for field slaves. And then this is the area down below here where this other blacksmith shop is. So I'll give you a link to this map and a story map that talks about some of these metal detector surveys so you can get to be a little more familiar with some of this stuff. But for the metal detector surveys, we use that to, figure out where to place the excavation units. And for the excavation units, I want to give you just a, semblance of this so you know what you're going to be doing. You're going to be in these 5x5 units, with staff and, your fellow expedition participants doing excavations, learning how we excavate stratigraphically, screening the soil at the shaker screens to recover the artifacts, and then also working in our field lab to do some of the washing and the processing of the artifacts. And so with all this, for the week, you're going to get a really intensive view on is how, we use these excavation units to investigate these areas that we've done metal detector surveys on. And the kind of excavations that we've done in the South Yard, where we have lots and lots of units opened up, basically this shot right here showing the overseer's site where we finished up and have a scatter shot of units. This is giving us an idea. And hold on, my cat is scratching down the door. She wants to be fed. Let me just throw some food at her. sounds like there's a wild raccoon outside trying to tear apart the doors. So keep her quiet for a little bit. But what we're doing with our excavation units this season is doing what's called a phase 2 excavation, where we get enough excavation units to find where the features are, know what kind of deposits we're encountering, whether it's plowed or unplowed, the kind of data we're recovering from excavation deposits, so that we go in and we do the kind of investigations where, let's see, let me see how far we have to flip back to get to the south yard. Yeah, these kind of excavations where we open up a bunch of 5x5s all in one area. It gives us an idea of where to do these extensive excavations, where we're finding features, and then also what we're going to encounter. So one of the features that we recently found at the blacksmith shop is this beauty right here. It doesn't look like much, but it's 3 bricks. And I can tell you, in the 20 years of doing archaeology at Montpelier, the only place we've found bricks that are in a line is where we've got a building that has a brick chimney. And if you're thinking about a blacksmith shop, you know, what do you think that brick chimney would be used for?
Heating up the metal.
Heating up the metal. Yeah, the forge. Exactly. So when we found this, we were absolutely ecstatic. You know, even though we didn't find the forge, finding these bricks, the only kind of structures that have a brick pier are ones that have a brick chimney. And what we found in this area was lots and lots of slag. And then in the units that were adjacent to it, not much slag, but a lot of discarded iron. So we think we know where the forge is. And so this season, you know, it's going to sound a little bizarre that, you know, we don't, you know, since we found the forge, we don't just open up a ton of units there. What we want to do is understand this entire area. So we're doing just enough excavations to be like, okay, we found the forge, we found where these nail concentrations are, where we've got, you know, this kind of stratigraphy. Then we're moving on to the next site to investigate all these other buildings, like the, you know, this blacksmith shop down here at the bottom, all these sites that show up in this metal detector survey in red. So basically all these areas where you've got these red concentrations, and actually I can vary this to, let's see, if I ramp this up. Yeah, if I change the red here to more intense, basically all these areas in red, we're going to want to be placing units because it's likely there's features there. And then also what we do is shovel test pits, which are little round holes we dig in the ground every 10 feet in these concentrations to locate where potential features are located. So, so that's basically, you know, what you're going to be up to this next week. And again, I'll stop screen sharing here. And what I want to do is give you some background so you understand first, you know, what a 5x5 unit looks like, and then why in the world we're putting these 5x5s in across the landscape. Basically, you know, what we're doing with the survey of the home farm is to identify all the sites that are out there. And the next step is going to be talking with the descendant community, you know, and really begin to, you know, to look at what sites they feel are significant to excavate of their ancestors, and to give them input, you know, get their input on, you know, the kind of questions they'd like to ask of these sites. And one thing that, I don't know if you all have followed any of the news about Montpelier, but most in the 2 weeks ago, the Montpelier Foundation board voted to have the executive board be made up of half descendant community members. And there's a descendant committee that's made up of Montpelier descendant community members, that they have their own organization, their own 501(c)(3), they're raising money, doing projects, and we're basically joining our 2 organizations. And, you know, the kind of what we've produced, like the exhibit that's really given us a name out in the museum world has been the exhibit you're going to see next week, which is, you know, that mirror distinction of color exhibit that's over in the main house. And that one we designed with the community. And so what we're moving towards in the future is doing, you know, research projects, all our research and interpretation in conjunction with the descendant community. And we'll talk more about this this coming week, and especially the project that we're going to be doing next, which is the excavations at the slave cemetery, where the descendant community wants to memorialize that space. And I think it's on Tuesday morning. I'm giving you all a no, Wednesday morning. I'm giving you all a tour of that space. So, but with all this, does anybody have any questions about any of the, you know, what you're going to be doing next week, or any of the history or things that you want to learn more about that you haven't heard much about, or what you expected you'd be doing versus what I just told you we'd be doing? Anybody surprised about what you might be working on? Yeah, Hannah, what's up? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just random question. I was wondering if when we tour the grounds at all, if we're going to be learning about any like indigenous communities that also lived there before, obviously, the Madisons had it.
Yeah, we definitely can talk about that. When I give you all a tour of this of the cemeteries, I'll point out what we've learned about that at Mount Pleasant. Um, the Manahoac are the group that were these are their native areas in the at the time of contact in the late woodland period. This is like 1000 AD, like about, you know, 17 from like I'd say around 2000 to around like about 500 years ago. And the area where we're at, there were, like at the main house, there was a semi-permanent village that was there. But most all of the Native American sites we found have been radically disturbed in the 18th century by either plowing, or in the case of where the site was, the village was the main house, basically that all the topsoil was scraped off the top of that hill, put into a pile, and then redeposited. And this was in the 18 teens. And so it disturbed, we found lots and lots of Native American ceramics, but they're all in a redeposited context, which means for archaeology, it's really hard to make any interpretation other than just the ceramics we found. We're not able to associate them with the features or other deposits that they were originally in that context with. So when you're at the site, you know, what you're going to learn about is that context is absolutely everything. And what do you think context means when it comes to an archaeology site?
The way that artifacts are laid out kind of like details how they interacted with each other, how people interacted with them, as well as like the relation to different buildings and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That's, yeah, real nice succinct answer, Tyler. That it's basically their horizontal and vertical position at the site that we record, and then exactly how they, whether they're found in a trash hole, whether it's a cellar hole or a post hole, how they're situated, you know, on the site. And then how they relate to the built environment. So for a lot of the Native American sites, that context has been lost. And the larger sites that Montpelier was used as hunting grounds for thousands of years, but again, there is so much agricultural activity, a lot of that's been lost. But we need, you know, we still, you know, it's something we need to do more on, is interpreting the Native American presence. So yeah, Macy.
Yeah, so you said like there's evidence of it being a hunting ground. So like in addition to finding ceramics, have you also found like evidence of lithics as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we have found all kinds of Native American points. And so for example, at the field quarter where the log cabins are reconstructed today on the landscape, that site we found a large number of points, and they ranged in date from like 8,000 years ago all the way up until, you know, the woodland burning points, which are about 1000 AD. And they're all in the same stratigraphic layer in the yards of the enslaved community, the households that were there. And at first we were thinking that they might have been collected by, enslaved laborers when they were doing their field work. But then we also started finding debitage, like shattered flakes, which showed that they were being, worked on there. And it's unlikely that, we don't find evidence of, stone tools being used by the enslaved community. And, in some sites they do find that, especially earlier colonial sites, but not there. So it's that's probably where the field quarters is probably like a hunting camp, a residence, and it's above a spring, so it's a good location for it. Cool. Well, if you all, if there's anything that you all want more information on, don't hesitate to either write myself or Sarah Lee. And she put my phone number in there. I'll, if for some reason you're late getting to Arlington House, probably and it's like around after 5:30, it's probably better to call the Arlington House number. And I'm going to put that into the chat because we don't get cell service at Arlington House. And the number for Arlington House is 540-672-2769. 540-672-2769. Yeah, I got to do like a phone layout. So there it is right there. And that's Arlington House. And we've got a landline there that somebody will pick up on. So, but really looking forward to seeing you all. Again, any questions about what to bring, any other information you want to know, let us know, and we'll get you the info that you need. So, and let me make sure. Yeah, I got everybody's vaccination status. Yeah. So, is anybody else staying on the property other than Tyler? I think everybody else is driving in. So Tyler, I think Sarah Lee wrote to you when you can, get into the house there. And if you have any questions on that, let me know, okay? So, and if you might want to arrive a little bit earlier to drop your stuff off there, and that would mean going into the property. But everybody else, when you arrive, don't go onto the property, like don't follow the signs from Montpelier. Follow the signs that are in the email for how to get to Arlington House. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you all, and have a good rest of the week. And again, if you have any questions, let us know. So thanks, everybody. We'll send you a recording of this. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Real quick, I just
Oh,
had a
yeah.
question. What kind of rubber gloves? Like disposable gloves, like thin or like
For the gardening gloves should be like what you get at a hardware store. Like think about pushing dirt through a screen. So either leather or heavy cloth gloves. That'd be the best thing. I know some people get really dry hands, and so they'll actually wear like rubber gloves under the cloth gloves, like regular gloves that you think about like as being rubber gloves. If you wore rubber gloves at the site, they would just become shredded in like 5 minutes. So cool. All right. Thanks, Catherine. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.